in verse 25. And after certain days, this is verse 24, and after certain days when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, Go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. So Paul's appearing before Felix. He witnesses to him. Felix says essentially, I've heard enough. When I have a convenient time to hear you, please come back then. Verse 26, notice this. He hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might loose him. Wherefore he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. So this is fascinating. Obviously what's happened is Felix has examined Paul. Paul obviously isn't guilty of any wrongdoing. There's no punishment that's imposed, but he doesn't release him. What he's hoping will happen is that Paul will decide to give him some money, and then Felix will just decide to let him go. So what Felix apparently does, he sent for him the oftener. So he does it again and again, hoping that, I suppose, that Paul will get the message and just buy his freedom. Now, by the way, we saw earlier in Acts 24 that Felix was well versed in the affairs of the Jews, and that he seemed to have perceived the truth in what Paul was teaching. And obviously what's happened is Felix has made the decision that he just wants money, right? What he wants from Paul is simply for Paul to pay him. What Paul, of course, does is Paul just gives him the truth. He doesn't make any payment to him. So look with me then at verse 27. Verse 27. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So notice what happens in verse 27. Paul apparently spends 2 years in custody, where Felix meets with him from time to time, hoping to receive a gift. It doesn't happen, so Paul just stays in custody that whole time, even though there's really no basis for him to be held. So then what happens is Festus is going to be replaced by Felix. So Felix now has to figure out what to do with Paul. If you followed what's going on from Acts 22 onward, really 21 onward, Paul keeps being brought before different governmental authorities who keep sort of passing the buck or punting and looking for someone else to handle it. So notice this carefully. So Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So what he's doing is he's not making a determination based upon what should happen or shouldn't happen. Felix makes the determination that the leaders of the Jews would be happier to have Paul bound, and so Felix abides by that request. It's the sort of thing where, unfortunately what happens a lot in life is that legal matters are decided on the basis of political considerations. That's what's happening there. Felix is deciding, well, the Jews, who I'm responsible for governing, they really want this to happen, and why do I care about Paul anyway? So I'm willing to do them a favor, because obviously there's no basis for keeping Paul in custody. And by the way, what's happening here then is Felix is sort of just passing this along to his successor. So that brings us to Acts chapter 25. Look at verse 1. Now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him, and desired favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. So what the high priest does is he wants Paul, instead of being tried in Caesarea, he wants him brought to Jerusalem. And if in fact Paul is brought to Jerusalem, what the high priest is anticipating there is that they're going to be able to ambush him, take control of him, and kill him. And obviously there's no intention there to actually have a lawful proceeding. It's just to do away with Paul. Get with me, if you would, Luke chapter 13. Luke chapter 13, verse 33. Luke chapter 13, verse 33. Nevertheless, this is the Lord speaking, I must walk today and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet perish outside of Jerusalem. Fascinating verse. So as you think of the Old Testament prophets, if Luke 13:33 is correct, where did they all die? They all died in Jerusalem, in the capital of Judaism, which is a testimony to the corruption of the leadership and the religious authorities in Jerusalem. As you look back in history, the normal human inclination is to think the sins of the past, the errors, the wicked things that happened, if I were there, I would be on the right side. In other words, I wouldn't be part of the misdeeds that occurred. We all think that because we all imagine ourselves to do the right thing. But of course, the reality of human history is that what happens is it unfolds, and the mass of humanity frequently is on the wrong side. Frequently, they're doing things that they hadn't ought to do. And what you see from Luke 13:33 is that the leadership of Judah for years and years and years and years was such that when God sent the prophets to them, their reaction was to kill them. To put it another way, Israel didn't stone the prophets for lying. It stoned them for telling the truth. The prophets showed up, prophesied against Israel and Judah for their wickedness, and the response of the leaders was to kill them. So what's happening here is the high priest wants Paul brought to Jerusalem, and Paul will be dealt with summarily, not according to actually having due process. So verse 4, back to Acts chapter 25. Acts chapter 25, verse 4. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea. In other words, he's not going to go down to Jerusalem, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. So Festus rejects the Jews' proposal and decides the trial will be held in Caesarea. Verse 5. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me, and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. So far, what Festus is doing makes a lot of sense. What he's saying is, if you actually have a claim, if you actually have a basis for some sort of complaint against Paul, come with me, make your case, and I'll evaluate it in Caesarea. Verse 6. And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. So Festus spends some period of time, more than 10 days, in Jerusalem before going down to Caesarea, and then commands Paul to be brought, which is actually fairly quickly, right? So Paul is getting his day in court before Festus reasonably promptly. If you recall, we saw just a few verses ago that what Felix did is he left him bound for 2 years for really no reason. Verse 7. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about, and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. So they make all sorts of accusations, but there's no evidence to support the accusations. And this has happened earlier in other proceedings. Verse 8. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. Get with me Acts 23, verse 1. Acts 23, verse 1. We're rewinding a little bit in time here where Paul was brought before the council. Notice what he says. And Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. When Paul says this, Ananias the high priest commands him to be smitten on the mouth, viewing this essentially as dishonest, lying, disingenuous. But it's really rather clear that it's actually Paul's making a true statement there. He was living in good conscience in the sense that, just as we see in Acts chapter 25, he wasn't offending against Caesar, he wasn't offending against Israel, he wasn't offending against the temple, he wasn't doing any of those things. In fact, it's rather clear that he was abiding by those things. So Paul makes that point to Festus. Go back to Acts 25, verse 9. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, so he's desirous here of helping them out, answered Paul and said, Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me? So rewind back to Acts chapter 24, verse 27. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So we can see in a short amount of space here, Festus is willing to do the Jews a pleasure. Felix is willing to do the Jews a pleasure. And obviously what's happening here is this is a criminal trial of Paul as to whether or not he's guilty of something. And the idea of just doing a favor for someone that would like to, that has an interest in the outcome is totally inappropriate. The judicial officer is charged with following the law, with administering justice. And it's not about doing things just to make people happy, but we see here Festus is inclined to do the Jews a pleasure just as Felix was. So then consider this. So if you recall earlier, Festus, when the Jews wanted Paul brought from Caesarea to Jerusalem, he said, no, we're going to go down there and have the trial. Now it seems like he's changed his mind, or he's proceeding in a different direction. So what he's decided here is he's willing to have Paul brought from Caesarea to Jerusalem. That raises the question of the following. So does Festus not understand what that really means? In other words, does Festus think that it's just be better to hold the matter in Jerusalem, or does he actually understand, hey, this is a way I can get rid of this case, right? What I'll do is we'll change the venue, and along the way, if Paul gets kidnapped and killed, well, that's not my fault. It seems to me that what happens, you can form your own conclusion as we read through some other verses here. It seems to me that Festus has an awareness, has an understanding of what this request for a change of venue really means. And he's willing to go along with it. This then means that Festus is actually doing a worse job than Felix. So Felix, if you recall, Felix's approach to Paul was, I'm going to leave him locked up, I'll keep summoning him to meet with me, and hopefully he'll pay me a bribe and I can let him go. That's not the way that he should be operating, but okay, fine. Festus decides, what I'm willing to do is I'm willing to transfer the case down to Jerusalem, which, wink, wink, really is, I'm willing to move this and let Paul be kidnapped and done away with. I believe that's what's going on there. You can reach your own conclusion. Verse 10, Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong. Notice this last part. As thou very well knowest. The last part is what makes me think that Festus is up to no good. In other words, Festus has heard all the allegations. he knows that Paul hasn't done anything wrong. And so it would seem he understands that the Jews' request for change of venue, which, by the way, it isn't that far away and doesn't really make a difference where it's held. If the trial's already going on there, why does it need to be moved? Well, the only reason it needs to be moved is someone is plotting. So what Paul does in verse 10 is he says, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat. In other words, he's making an appeal unto Caesar. What he's doing is he's deciding to basically opt out of Festus's jurisdiction over him. In other words, he's appealing to a higher court and saying, okay, now you can't decide this, you have to send me to the higher court. In other words, what Paul's concerned about, look with me at verse 11. For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. Paul's point is there's no basis for taking action against me. Now, by the way, notice what he says there, I refuse not to die. Paul clearly understands the issue here is a death sentence, right? He's not talking here about being fined or imprisoned or something. It's the penalty that's in view is a death sentence. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. You see Paul's point? In other words, I get what's going on here. I appeal unto Caesar because what you're getting ready to do, when you're suggesting we transfer the case to Jerusalem, what you're suggesting is we're going to physically move there, but what's going to happen is you're going to essentially turn me over to them. You're going to allow me to be apprehended. In other words, all he has to do is send Paul in a lightly guarded convoy. The Jews will grab him and kill him. So Paul says, I get what you're doing. You can't rightfully deliver me up to death because I haven't done anything worthy of it. And so that's why Paul appeals to Caesar. Look with me, go back to Acts chapter 23, verse 29. Acts chapter 23, verse 29. This is Claudius Lysias when he wrote unto Felix. Notice verse 29. Whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. The ongoing theme here is Paul's been examined by multiple folks within the Roman government. No one can find anything he's done that's wrong. And so Paul has no confidence. He fears that what Festus is about to do is to deliver him. So he says, I appeal unto Caesar. Acts 25, verse 12. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. So they consult as to what the appropriate thing to do is, and they decide to send Paul to Caesar. Get with me Acts 26, verse 32. So we're skipping ahead here, but I want you to see a verse. Then said Agrippa unto Festus, This man might have been set at liberty if he had not appealed unto Caesar. So here's what I think is the case as to how the Roman appellate system worked. When Paul made the appeal to Caesar, it was required that he be sent there. The current court that was exercising jurisdiction could not continue to exercise jurisdiction, including simply to let him go. When Paul makes that appeal, he has to go there. That's what I take Acts 26:32 to mean. If you go back to Acts 25, in verse 12, then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. What apparently they're doing there is they're deliberating, and I believe what they're concluding there is he's made this appeal. There's no other option, but he now has to be sent unto Caesar. Verse 13, Acts 25, verse 13. And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. So King Agrippa is traveling, and it seems what's going on is he's traveling throughout his realm of what he's responsible for, and he decides to visit Governor Festus. Governor Festus, I believe, being a subordinate to King Agrippa. So Agrippa's traveling throughout his area of responsibility. He visits Festus. Verse 14. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, there is a certain man left in bonds by Felix. So what Festus does here is Agrippa is visiting, and it seems what Festus is doing is he's essentially delivering a report to his superior. What's going on with the responsibilities that I have? What are the key pending matters, essentially? Festus says, Agrippa, well, here's one thing we've got. One thing we've got is I have this matter of Paul where Felix left him in custody, and I'm now figuring out what to do with him. Verse 15. About whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. So when Festus traveled to Jerusalem, we saw this earlier in the chapter, the Jews mentioned to Festus that they wanted judgment against Paul. Now, here's what I think is going on there. The Jews at that point are governed by Rome. Festus was listening to their concerns to see what he could do to address them and make them reasonably happy. In other words, the Romans were ruling over the Jews. In order to keep domestic peace and avoid problems as much as possible, they would listen to the concerns, figure out if there was a way to address those concerns without harming Rome's interest. So it seems to me that's what Festus is doing. So here's what I think is interesting about that. So when Festus goes to Jerusalem to meet with the Jews, and they share their concerns with him. The Jews are a governed people, right? In other words, they're under Rome's jurisdiction. The Jews are not going to be able to present a list of 100 demands and say, here are the 100 things, Festus, that we'd like you to fix, right? Because Festus can decide, look, I'm being nice to listen to your concerns and see what we can do, but you're not running the show, right? So what that tells you is this, and this is just an insight on human nature. For the Jews in Jerusalem, which have all kinds of issues being under Roman rule, right? Does any people group like to be governed by a foreign power? Of course not. One of their highest priorities is, would you please, please, please do something about this Paul fellow? As if that's one of the greatest problems that the Jews face under Roman rule. What I think that tells you is the degree of hatred that men have for the truth. What did Paul do that was causing Israel any sort of problem? He was in Jerusalem because after traveling throughout Macedonia and Achaia and various other places, he brings alms to Jews in Jerusalem. In other words, there are poor saints in Jerusalem. Paul brings a gift to them. He's keeping the Old Testament law. He's not teaching against the temple. He's not doing any of the things of which he's accused. What's really going on? What's really going on is hatred of the truth. That's what's motivating them. There was nothing that Paul did that was worthy of death. But when the Jews meet with Festus, here's the big problem we have. You know what it is? It's not Roman soldiers abusing people. It's not violence. It's not extortion. It's not any of those things. It's Paul! Which just tells you the degree of men's hatred for the truth. Verse 16, Acts 25:16. To whom I answered, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die. Notice what's being said there. Festus says, I responded to the Jews' request when they wanted judgment against Paul. They didn't want to give him a parking ticket. They didn't want to fine him. What did they want? They wanted him to be put to death when clearly he hasn't done anything worthy of death. So what Festus does in verse 16, to whom I answered, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before that he which is accused, notice this, have the accusers face to face and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. So what Festus does there when he's talking about the manner of the Romans, he's talking about Roman law and customs. And what he says there is that the rights of the accused, he mentions two particular things. The first is that he has the right to confront his accusers face to face. And the second thing he mentions is the right to answer for himself. So this is just an interesting thing. If you look at the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, so if you look at the Bill of Rights, if you look at the Sixth Amendment, I'll read it to you. So the Sixth Amendment, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. Now it's interesting to think about, right? If you remember, Festus dealt with this matter within 10 days or so after coming into office. Felix had left Paul sit for essentially 2 years. So that's an interesting thing. The right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation. In other words, they have to have notice of what it is they're accused of. Then listen to this. To be confronted with the witnesses against him. To have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Now I want to focus on to be confronted with the witnesses against him. The idea there is, under U.S. law, that when someone is accused of a crime, they can confront their accusers, the witnesses against them. What do you think the reason for that is? Well, one of the reasons is it harder for people to lie about you in your presence or outside your presence? It's much harder for people to lie to your face, right? So one of the virtues, the Sixth Amendment, is it's a very good and proper thing. You can see that it's one of the other places that concept appears is in Roman law. And it's something that's a good, healthy protection for someone that is accused of a crime. The second item in Acts 25:16 is the right to answer for himself. And that's what we sometimes call the right to be heard. In the vernacular, you often hear about getting your day in court. And it's the idea that you have an opportunity to be heard, to make your points, to say what you want to say to the finder of fact, to the trier of the case, before there's some sort of decision. One thing that's fascinating, I'll just share this with you, is one thing that modern courts are doing a lot because of the sheer volume of cases that exist, is they're using more mediation and arbitration proceedings where people have a chance to tell their side, and the act of giving them the opportunity to tell their side often leads to some sort of resolution of the case. In other words, isn't it a basic human desire, if you're accused of something, to want to respond and tell your side of the story? I mean, we all understand that. In that regard, it's fascinating that Jesus Christ, how did he respond when he was accused? He didn't say anything. One of the reasons I believe is he had decided what the result would be. Jesus Christ was crucified not simply because men decided it. He was crucified fundamentally because God the Father had decided it, right? And so what Jesus Christ did is he was silent before his accusers because he wasn't going to blow up and prevent the charade from occurring. You follow me? If he had pointed out all the flaws in the charges against him, it would not have contributed to the crucifixion happening. It would have been something that would have encouraged the opposite result. Get with me, John chapter 7. John chapter 7, verse 51. I want to show you a similar concept in Jewish law. Doth our law judge any man before it hear him and know what he doeth? So the idea of the opportunity to be heard, the idea of due process, is something that is found in both Roman law and Jewish law, and of course is found in American law today. Go back to Acts 25 if you would. So what Festus is saying there is the Jews want judgment against Paul. And Festus says, well, look, I mean, I can't do that unless there's witnesses, and he has the right to confront him, and I have to give him an opportunity to be heard, which, by the way, Jewish law required that as well. So verse 17, therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth. So without any delay is similar to the notion of the right to a speedy trial. So Paul was brought forth so that he could face his accusers. Verse 18, against whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed. So when Festus describes what's happening here, he says they came and the accusations they made, that wasn't at all what I thought they were going to say. Verse 19, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. So when Festus hears the charges that are brought against Paul, he views the matter as this is some sort of religious dispute about Jewish doctrine, and Jesus Christ, who is dead, but Paul claims to be alive. Verse 20, and because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. Now, when Festus is telling this to Agrippa, he doesn't mention anything about what that request really means, right? He's not telling his boss, hey, yeah, by the way, so what the Jews wanted to do is their solution to this whole proceeding was if you just send him our way, if you just change venue, then we can resolve this and it'll be simpler for everyone. Well, he doesn't really share with Agrippa, Festus doesn't, what that actually would mean. There's another principle in verse 20 that's interesting, and that's this. When it says, because I doubted of such manner of questions, what American courts don't like to do is to get involved in deciding matters of religious doctrine. So sometimes when there are church disputes and they end up in litigation, American courts don't like to get in the business of deciding who is right because it's a hard thing for a secular tribunal to do. That's the same sentiment that Festus is mentioning right there. So verse 21, but when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, that's Caesar, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. So get with me, Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9, verse 15. Acts 9:15. As we turn to Acts 9, we're obviously turning to Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. I want you to notice something that the Lord tells Paul early on in his ministry. Acts 9, verse 15. But the Lord said unto him, Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles, then notice this, and kings and the children of Israel. When God saved Saul and then renamed him Paul, one of the things God specifically told Paul that he was going to do is he was going to appear before kings. As best I can tell, the first time that happens is in Acts chapter 25, when Paul appears before King Agrippa. So Acts chapter 25, verse 23. And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice with great pomp, and was entered into the place of the hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city, at Festus' commandment Paul was brought forth. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. So this is the guy that the Jews want to kill, is what Festus is saying. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I have decided to send him. In other words, the Jews wanted to kill this guy, but when I examined him, I found that he didn't do anything that was worthy of death. He appealed unto Caesar, so I want to now send him unto Caesar. But notice this. Look at verse 26. Of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and specially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination had, I might have somewhat to write. So this is fascinating. What Festus is saying here is, the guy's done nothing worthy of death. He's appealed unto Caesar, so I have to send him unto Caesar. But in sending him unto Caesar, I need to explain what the charge is. In other words, why am I sending this case to you? And what Festus is saying is, I'm not sure what to say. I'm not sure what I should write. So what I'm doing, King Agrippa, is I'm having him appear before you, because maybe you can help me figure out what I'm supposed to write, what would be helpful. Now let me go back just for a minute. I read you a moment ago the text of the Sixth Amendment. I want to read you part of it again. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. I'm going to skip a part. And to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation. Let's just pause there for a minute as to what that means. When someone, this is at least under the American judicial system, when someone is accused of a crime, there has to be a specific indictment or an information that is charged against them. And it has to spell out specifically what provision of law they are claimed to have violated. It can't be just generally, so-and-so is a bad guy or a troublemaker or something like that. Obviously, it is unfair to issue an indictment or a charge that is just vague and ambiguous. There's no way for the defendant to prepare a defense of himself if he doesn't really know the specificity of the charges. Well, Roman law had a similar concept, and what Festus is concerned about here is, as he sends Paul along to Caesar, Caesar is going to have to figure out what to do with this case, and Caesar is going to also have to, but in the act of doing that, Caesar is going to evaluate whether Festus has done a good job handling the case. In other words, Does Caesar want to be bothered with things that his subordinates ought to be able to handle? And the answer to that is no, right? So if Festus is sending this case along, which he has to do because Paul appealed unto Caesar, Festus has to figure out, what am I going to write? How am I going to summarize the nature of these charges? Verse 27. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. And he's right. It's incredibly unreasonable to send someone as a prisoner without a specific explanation of what the charges are. And if he were to do that, Caesar would likely form the opinion, Festus doesn't know what he's doing, right? He's obviously not very capable if he's putting these problems, he's sending them to me to handle. I obviously need to replace him and put someone who's competent in his place. So that brings us to the end of Acts chapter 25. We'll stop there and we'll pick up with Acts 26 verse 1 during the next session. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to meet. We can meet safely. We don't have any fear of harm. We thank you, Lord, that we can meet together and glorify your Son. It's in his name we pray. Amen.